Hello and welcome back for another VMK in Game Development Series. In this VMK we're going to wrap up our work with our new mouse input version 2.0 by adding a custom mouse cursor that we can control using the mouse. So let's jump right into our code and get started. What we're going to need to do is, let's see here, inside of scene.cpp we're right now rendering the X and Y coordinates to our console window. And we want to have a control so that we know when we want to display the mouse on the screen and when we want to hide it. We can do this by adding a parameter into our console param structure. So let's go into the declaration here of console param. And in here we're going to add a new variable. It's going to be a boolean, and I'm just going to call it bmouse. So whenever this is true, we want to display the mouse, and when it's false, we don't want to display the mouse. So by default, we're going to set it to be false. And now we're going to toggle this variable true or false depending on whether we turn the console window on or off. And that's happening right now inside of our scene under console. Was it console render? Yeah, in here. So if we're in this first if statement here, we're still scrolling downward, which means that the console is open and we want to turn our variable on. So we're going to go and take him, bmouse, and set him equal to true. And if we're still scrolling upward, meaning our console window is now closing, we want to disable the mouse so you don't see it. So we're going to set it to false. With that in place, we now need to be able to use this variable to decide when we want to render the mouse on the screen. We already know that the mouse is only going to be a 2D kind of object, so we can render it directly inside of our HUD. It's not going to be a 3D mouse. We're not going to be able to move the mouse in the Z direction, so we don't have to worry about placing it inside of our original game code. Instead, we're going to place it inside of our HUD because in here we've switched our display mode to be an ortho projection matrix, which means it's basically 2D, and we go in and render our console at the very top, and we're just going to go down here near the bottom and add this new check. If our mouse is turned on, meaning it's true, then we want to render our cursor, so we're going to create a function called cursor render, and this will handle positioning the cursor on the screen as well as rendering it. So let's go and define this guy inside of scene.h now. I'll just place it here between HUD and console render. And inside of scene.cpp, let's go and implement our function. So we have cursor render. This will draw our cursor, spelling error here, on the screen. And I guess I should show you how I've saved this cursor inside of our TGA file. What I've done is I went inside of our GUI.tga file, and I've added a section here underneath our console where I just had some free space. You can place this anywhere you like. And I've sort of sectioned off an area here. And inside it, I've drawn my cursor. It's sort of a bluish color. And in behind it, I've set up the alpha values such that you can see right through all the pixels here, which are checkered. Everywhere outside here where it's white, that's not part of the cursor, so you don't have to worry about it. And the cursor itself is completely opaque, so you won't be able to see through it. But you will be able to see through all the area here, which is checkered. You need to do this because if you don't, you'll basically have a square block for your cursor, which is, well, if you wanted a square block as your cursor, that's perfectly fine. But in most games, you want your cursor to look a little bit more interesting rather than just a square block. So in that case, you're going to need to use some sort of alpha value so that you can remove the pixels that are not part of the cursor but yet still inside of the rectangular region here. We're using a rectangular region because when we go and render it, we're restricting our renderer, our OpenGL renderer, to be rendering a box on the screen. So in here, we're setting up our model view matrix. Initially, we set it to identity. We're going to specify we're going to be using a texture, so we're going to be loading in our texture ID number for the GUI texture that we loaded up inside of our initialize. We set our color to be white, and then we're specifying here we're going to be rendering a rectangle or a quad. The quad itself inside of our TGA file is 30 pixels wide by 39 pixels high. And again, the numbers that you specify here really depend on how large you make your cursor inside of the TGA file. I've placed it such that it's flush with the left-hand side and it's vertically offset by 886 pixels. So using those values there, you can get your texture coordinates, which are shown here, and your vertex coordinates, which are shown here. At the end, you call GLEnd, and also don't forget to disable your GL textures. So now let's go and run our code and take a look at what happens. Oh, it looks like we forgot to do something here. I've added a parameter in here which I haven't described yet, so I'm just going to take that out for a second. We're going to put it in a minute once I show you exactly what's going on. Alright, so when we're moving around inside of our game, you notice we have no cursor, and then as soon as we press the tab key, we have our cursor. And everything appears to be working correctly, but as a matter of fact, it's not. And the reason why it's not is because the hotspot for our cursor right now is designated at one of the corners of our quad, but it's not located at the correct corner. If you notice that when I move it horizontally to the left, remember, as soon as my cursor exits the window, the update on the screen will stop. So as I'm moving towards the left, you notice it reaches the edge and then it stops. So it seems to be okay that our hotspot is located somewhere on the left-hand side. Now let's move it all the way to the far right. You notice the cursor is being chopped off on the right side until it's off the screen. So that looks okay. But now let's move it down. If I move it down to the very bottom, you'll notice that it stopped before the very tip of the arrow reached the bottom part. And if I move it upward, you notice I can move it way, way, way beyond the top edge of the window until it disappears like so. So that tells me that our hotspot is really located at the bottom left-hand corner of our icon. And if you go through our code, which I can show you here, the way we render this is we specify our initial coordinate is x, y. So this is the x, y coordinate of our mouse, which we received from our user settings up here. Then we draw horizontally, then we go up to draw the top right-hand corner, and then we move back across to draw the top left-hand corner. So our home position, or our hotspot, really is the bottom left-hand corner of our quad. But that's not what we want. According to the way that I created this cursor, we really want the hotspot to be located at the top left-hand corner, sort of at the very tip of where that image is located. Let me go into PaintShop Pro and actually point it out. I want the hotspot to be located right here, basically, whereas right now the hotspot is located right here because of the way that the code is written. So what we're going to do is create a couple variables to create an offset, and the offset is going to determine how to render this object with respect to the XY coordinates that we're getting from the mouse, but we're going to offset them in such a way so that the hotspot is located right here. So let's see how we can do that. We first need to go inside of usersettings.h and create a couple more variables, and these will contain the offset x and the offset y value for our hotspot. Inside of our constructor, we need to define what those values need to be. The values themselves are going to really depend on the shape and size of the cursor. You may want to flip this cursor around so that it actually points to the right direction rather than the left as shown here. So maybe you want your hotspot located over here. Or maybe you want a downward facing arrow. In that case, you'd place your hotspot located over here. It really depends on what you're trying to do. But anyway, I will want to set up my hotspot in the top left-hand corner here. So inside of the constructor, we're going to set up these variables initially to 0, and then I'm going to create a function that will allow us to set these values. So I'm just going to go down to the very bottom of our functions here and add the following. set mouse offset position for the hotspot. And it's going to take in an X and a Y value, and we're just going to save those inside of our offset member variables. Now we actually need to call this set mouse offset function from somewhere so that we can give these offset values for the X and Y. And I'm going to do that inside of our OpenGL initialize function. Just at the very bottom, right here. I'm going to set the mouse offset to be 3 horizontally and 35 pixels vertically. So if you look over here, from the left edge, if we move 3 pixels to the left, and then from the bottom edge here of our reference, we move 35 pixels upward, that's where our offset is going to be located. Again, the location of the offset depends on your custom cursor. So if you're using a different shaped cursor, you're going to need to figure out roughly where you want to have your offset value located. Now that we have this offset value set, we need to be able to use it whenever we call our get and set mouse coordinates. So let's go inside of our functions here, and we're going to add in a variable here. Actually, let me do it this way. It'll be just a little bit quicker. So what I've done here is I've specified, we now have a parameter that you can specify. If it's true, then it's going to go inside of this if statement. By default, it's set to false, which means if you don't specify a parameter, we are going to skip over the offset and just return the regular x coordinate. So if we do have an offset, we're going to take the x coordinate and subtract from it the offset value. For the y coordinate here of the mouse, again, same sort of thing. We have a Boolean variable, bOffset. By default, it's set to false, but if you specify it to be true, then we're going to go inside of this if statement. And inside here, we're going to take the y value of our mouse position, and we're going to subtract from it our offset value. And that offset value, again, was the value that we set here inside of our initialize. Now, the reason why I've made this extra variable here is because when we're rendering inside of our console window the x and y coordinate of our mouse, we still want to be showing the correct value for the x and the y. The only time we need this offset is when we're actually rendering our mouse. Then we actually have to move our quad so that it compensates for this offset and it renders it at the correct location on our screen. So I think, let's go and build this now. I think this should be able to compile and run. And let's take a look here. So now we have our cursor on the screen, and when I move it to the left, it disappears, like so. So that looks okay, and we move it to the right. That looks okay. And then when we move it up, like so, and when we move it down, like so. Okay, so right now we're still getting the same behavior that we had before. The offset is somewhere at the bottom left-hand corner because the cursor doesn't actually move off the screen properly this way, and it doesn't move off the screen properly this way. The mouse should stop moving whenever we get to about here at the very top of the screen, but it actually lets you move forward all the way off the screen. And that's probably, oh right, that's because when we went and compiled the code before, I removed the true statement up here. So when we're rendering our cursor, we do want to use the offset. So that's why we need to specify inside getMouseX and getMouseY true here to say we do want to use the offset value. So let's go and build this now and try it out with the new offsets in place. So now moving to the left, cursor stops, moving to the right, cursor stops, moving up, cursor stops, and moving down, should disappear practically, and it stops. So now you can see our offset is located somewhere in the top left-hand corner, right about there. So that's how we get our cursor working, and you notice that because we're using an alpha value with our cursor, you notice that it sort of blends in nicely with the surrounding shape of our cursor. We don't get this sort of rectangular box. We are actually rendering a rectangular box, but because we have an alpha, you only see the parts that are opaque. Everything that is transparent you don't see, so you don't really see that it's a rectangular box or quad that we're rendering on the screen. Alright, we have a cursor working now, and we have our game engine up and running. So in the next video, we can start working with building some sort of GUI interface to be able to have a menu system and different kinds of controls which you can tune your game engine.